a moral objection to people feeling better. If it's sex, if it's drugs, if it's alcohol, if it's food, if it makes you feel good, you shouldn't be doing that thing.
From the industry to tobacco control starting to lie, to government starting to lie. And the sad thing in tobacco is that you now even have scientists beginning to lie.
Which drugs should we allow, if any? Which drugs should we ban, if any?
We have the law on the one hand, and we have human rights. How do we balance this?
The scientific community must also itself stand behind its evidence and shout up when policymakers clearly get it wrong and when lives matter.
Why?
Well, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this session on the policy and practice of drug, alcohol, and tobacco use during COVID-19. My name is Professor Himla Sudyal, and I am the Executive Officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa. This is surely going to be a very, very exciting session, and I am amidst the company of stalwarts in this field. I have with me Sean Shelley, who's very, very big in terms of policy and advocacy and human rights a manager at the TB and HIV care. I have Professor Francois Venter, an old colleague from my previous university, the Witwatersrand, and he's the director of Ezinsha. We also have Dr. Nkosi Letlapa, who until recently was the president of the Health Professionals Council of South Africa. And another colleague who will join us a little bit later, David Peterson, and he's in Copenhagen. And last but not least, we have Professor Julian Kindeleer, who has also been very, very active in various aspects of intellectual property law, etc., etc. So we have in our midst iconic professionals, and we're going to have a very engaging discussion on the topic, particularly as we, during our own lockdown, had to deal with several rules and regulations with respect to alcohol and tobacco use during our lockdown regulations. But up for discussion today is this kind of balancing of issues. On the one hand, we have the lawmakers who come up with various rules and regulations that we have to subscribe to. And on the other hand, we have the context of the rights of individuals. And how do we now balance what the state has to do in order to protect its individuals and its citizens, but at the same time be mindful and take into consideration the individual rights. And so this is a very complex scenario, and depending on how we feel emotionally on some days, we may either vie for a very stronger kind of support for the human rights side, and at the other times, we may scoff at what government puts into place for us to subscribe to by way of regulations. And then, of course, there's the rule of law. So we have the law on the one hand, and we have human rights. How do we balance this? And this is the challenge. And so my colleagues around the room today are going to give us some of their insights into this, but more specifically, to home in on the kind of ethical dimensions associated with this discourse. I want to thank the organizer of this panel, Aidan Gilligan from SciCom, who has put this exceptional panel together. And, he comes to us with the kind of slogan of making sense of science. So this is the environment or the framework for this afternoon's discussion. And so I would like to kick off by inviting Sean.
Good afternoon, and actually I'm talking today about the drugs that we consider illicit. And as a spoiler alert, I don't have any answers, but I have a question, or 3 questions. I've always had the same 3 questions right throughout my life. And that question is basically why? Those are the 3 questions. And when you're a kid and you use that on your parents and you go, why? It's a way of getting whatever you want. Because the first why they can answer, because I said so. That's usually the answer. Then another why, well, because maybe it's not that good for you. And the third why, they buy you chocolate. And I've been programmed to believe that I can get what I want by asking why. So, when I was working in the field of addressing people's problems with drugs, I used to ask them the same 3 questions. Maybe I was hoping to get drugs at the end of it, but it didn't work. But very seldom could somebody actually answer the third why. The first why was because I'm addicted. The second why was because somebody gave them to me. And the third why, they could seldom answer. But when you can answer that third one, you start getting to the crux of the problems we have. Now, the 3 points I want to get across today.
The first point is current policies are fundamentally a barrier to a free and equitable society. The second point I want to make is society is prepared to let people die and suffer to ensure that people don't suffer and die. The third one is there's this misnomer that says science is unbiased. Unfortunately, it's not. It is very biased in a lot of ways.
So, in order to make my 3 points, I want to start by telling 2 brief stories. The first one is the story of 2 drugs, and the second one is the story of 2 people. Now, the 2 drugs I want to talk about have very different reported outcomes. The one set of reported outcomes is that these particular drugs will increase cognition, they will improve reaction time, they will enable you to perform very well for extended periods of time. For people with ADHD, they will help them focus, they will take away the effects of sleep deprivation to a certain degree. Of course, nothing can take away sleep deprivation after a certain point. And they use them in people who are required to give the absolute optimal input in critical tasks when they are sleep deprived. Another set of drugs causes your teeth to drop out, causes cognitive defects, increases your chance of getting psychosis, and shouldn't be taken at all. They're the most dangerous drugs in the world, according to the American Attorney General. At the same time, the other drug was described by the Surgeon General as the moral and ethical thing to do, to take it or give it to these particular people they were giving it to. Of course, the drug is the same drug. It's methamphetamine. 2 different people, same drug, 2 very different outcomes. Now, if we think about that and we extrapolate that argument a little bit further and think about 2 people, we think about somebody who's maybe got ADHD, who comes from a relatively good school, that's got a good education, and they decide, for whatever reason, that they're going to experiment with methamphetamine. And they've got 2 choices. They might get caught. If they get caught, they will usually go to rehab. If they are lucky, they will go to a psychiatrist and they will get prescribed something like Adderall, not Adderall in this country, but methylphenidate, for example. On the other side, if you grew up in Lavender Hill and you got caught using methamphetamine, in common parlance of the area, you're likely to go to jail and your life is pretty much ruined. So we've got the science which tells us two totally different stories apparently. And we've got the human narrative, which has two totally different outcomes. And what I've come to realize as I've worked in this field for more than a decade is that really the science is cherry-picked to a large degree. Now, if we took any other field and we said there's one organization, which is essentially a political organization that funds 80% of all the research in the world, we would say, hang on, there's a good opportunity for bias there. If we restricted the research of a certain chemical to only the harms that that chemical can result in, we would assume that there was going to be some bias. NIDA funds about 80% of the worldwide research on drugs, and they will only fund research into the negative effects of drugs. You cannot go and do research on the benefits of cannabis using NIDA funding. So the question biases the science. The field we come from biases the science, because if we're looking at neuroimaging, for example, in the field of neuroscience, there are more positive results to the research than is statistically possible. We conveniently ignore the fact that we don't have a large range of sample or baseline results with which to compare our results. So sure, people with who are dependent on a particular drug will show clustering of brain activity towards one side of the bell curve, but nothing falls outside the bell curve. And if we know from other science that means nothing. It actually doesn't tell us anything. We need to go further. But we tend to be very myopic and look at single things. So the understanding that's coming to the common narrative is one that's informed not by science, but by a kind of political agenda. And similarly, we base our decisions not on sound ethics, but on moral judgments. And there's a very big difference between them. So the result of this is in the United States, we are prepared to let certain people die while other people live. If we look at the current opioid crisis, it's a very simple problem to solve. People using street opioids, by and large, do not want to die. They find meaning and purpose in those drugs for a variety of reasons. If you lived on the street, you would like to take a drug which makes you feel like you're warm, comfortable, not hungry, and it takes away the problems of the world. But when it's contaminated with fentanyl, each time you use it, you put your life at risk. The solution is simple. Imagine if that was beer, if that was Budweiser that was contaminated with methanol. We would very quickly have testing kits out there, and we would be supplying people with pure, tested, unadulterated beer. Why aren't we doing the same with opioids? Instead, what we do is we restrict them. We stop people who have a legitimate purpose for them from accessing them. The fact is some people do better on opioids, and we just need to get over it because it's a moral judgment if we decide they cannot access that. The number one reason for stopping the research into a particular antidepressant is because it brings about this unwanted side effect of euphoria, meaning a sense of well-being despite one's circumstances. I thought that was what an antidepressant was supposed to do. We have a moral objection to people feeling better. Fine is okay, better is not. 3 questions. Why? As scientists, we need to ask the same 3 questions repeatedly. And if you remain curious, I think we will find a lot of changes in the field of drugs and the way we respond to drugs. Because at the end of the day, there was no good that ever came out of putting somebody in jail for the use of a drug. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sean. So, wow, that was impressive, eh? The why, asking it, and then giving us the examples that you presented. All right, we will go on to the next presentation now, and it's my pleasure to invite Professor Francois Venter to actually speak to us on the alcohol use policy and practice under COVID-19. Over to you, Francois.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to talk, I think, with a focus on alcohol, but I want to just follow on from Sean's views because I want to talk about the medical profession's role in this and what I would consider to be unconscionable collusion in the process of demonizing drugs in general. and where we haven't played the reflective calm role in our patients' interests. So the first thing is I grew up as a South African doctor, and like every South African doctor, where I got thrust into the heart of Hillbrow. I saw people misusing alcohol, stabbing each other. It was terrible. I saw people die of lung cancer and emphysema who'd smoked their lives away. I saw people overdosing on opiates. I saw the ugliest side of substance abuse you could possibly talk about. And I kind of, in my head, very medical student, why can't we just restrict these things? What I realized is that a lot of what we were dealing with in terms of these drugs was actually not evidence-based. So my favorite thing with alcohol, for instance, is specifically to look at the fact that we have a huge amount of evidence that actually moderate amount of alcohol is actually really good for you. That as long as you're not driving and you're not operating petrol tankers and you're not flying aeroplanes, that actually small amounts and moderate amounts of alcohol is actually better. There's one major study which demonstrated, in fact, that teetotalers had a much higher, even correcting for the fact that those people were alcoholics. Once they corrected that, they demonstrated that people drinking moderate amounts of alcohol, several units a day, actually lived longer than people who were teetotalers or people who were just drinking. So it's well known in medicine, this J curve around alcohol. But what was interesting is there's a reverse J tick, which was that teetotalers had higher mortality. So my medical aid will reward me for buying fresh fruit and vegetables, for buying certain kinds of things, but will not reward me for buying moderate amounts of alcohol, which just demonstrates how anything, and this is why I think medicine is colluded, anything that feels good can't be good for you. It doesn't matter if it's sex, if it's drugs, if it's alcohol, if it's food. If it makes you feel good, you shouldn't be doing that thing. And that's why we have this very Calvinist approach to substance use. And I think that, as I said, our profession has colluded with that for decades as an instinctual Calvinist way of dealing with this stuff. And I think there needs to be serious self-reflection on the part of public health people, clinicians, people doing guidelines as to what harm we've actually visited on people. That rather than trying to help them, we've created a society that's incredibly judgmental in all of this. And we've had to fight this in the HIV world. We've realized that actually harm reduction programs work like a bomb. However, getting them past the public, because the politicians hate the drug addicts. They hate people having, anybody who's having sex that's not the kind of sex they're having, or what they're telling people they're having, is bad for the community. And I think the alcohol use, just bringing it back to COVID-19, is interesting. I think tobacco and cigarette smoking, I can't think of a single medical reason for why tobacco in the time of COVID should have been banned. I mean, I'm an anti-tobacco activist in the sense that I think that people shouldn't be smoking if at all possible, but I don't think it should be banned. I just think that there should be all sorts of the normal restrictions. But with alcohol, we could have made a really good argument for why we needed to preserve the ICU. We needed to preserve beds. But no, when people say, oh my God, we've got less alcohol trauma. Every medical person on the planet knows that Friday and Saturday night, since they were trained, is full of alcohol trauma. We did not need the COVID epidemic to bring that out. So suddenly to throw up their hand and say, this is the reason for us to restrict alcohol, just smacks again of this kind of moralism, people trying to find a way through. And that was what I think the South African government's response was. It was a moralistic view that we brought out. The things we don't like. We don't want people to smoke too much. We want them to go to church. We don't want them to go to be drinking too much. All these things got conflated into a response to COVID. And to my mind, it's where the public health response failed. And the problem with that is it's so nakedly moral, it means you lose the trust of the general public. And that's why I think in many ways, where we had complete buy-in to the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions at the start of the lockdown, once a society starts seeing the moral majority or the politicians and the people responsible for our well-being failing in that, that's when the trust relationship goes out. That's when the masks stop falling out. That's when you start having rage parties. And it all stems from this moralism around the science. And as I said, I think the medical profession needs to reflect quite hard on its role that's played within that.
Wow. Thank you very much. Various presentations are building up on the way in which our moral value system intersects with other discourses in society, but I'm sure we'll pick up that discussion a little bit further on. Okay, Professor Letlapa, it's over to you to tell us about tobacco and nicotine use and how policy and practice under this topic played out or is playing out during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Firstly, to correct that, thankfully for my sins, I'm just an ordinary doctor. I'm not a professor. And just to say that, it was interesting to listen to Sean talk about why. When you come into tobacco control, what you might be saying is lies, and more lies. And I guess part of it is who lied first, the industry, about the health effects of smoking. Who caught them out, tobacco control, and governments came to the party. What then happened? Come 1976, Michael Russell says, they actually addicted to the nicotine, but they killed by the tar. Nobody listens. Then you have alternatives that are less harmful than cigarettes, than combustible cigarettes. The pouch in Sweden. What happens? The WHO bans it, and it can only be found in Sweden. Fast track to now, who has less tobacco-related diseases? The Swedes, far more than anybody in Europe. But the thing that has helped them has been banned. So when you create alternatives, something that is more harmful, then the lying moves from the industry to tobacco control starting to lie, to government starting to lie. And the sad thing in tobacco is that you now even have scientists beginning to lie about these issues. You have scientists tell you that the less harmful products are actually more harmful than combustible cigarettes. Lies, and more lies. And that's the fundamental problem that we have. And we're creating a trust deficit with society. COVID. Some scientists say this, one says this in the US, Trump brings somebody else who says the opposite. Lies. What Francois is talking about. Lack of trust to the profession. I'm amazed at many doctors that will tell somebody, don't smoke. That will join the bandwagon of lies and say, don't even use e-cigarettes. Based on lies. Where's the ethical accountability of giving advice based on science? It's not there. As Francois said, we go in, we ban tobacco, we ban alcohol, and you have a stressful environment called COVID, and everybody is fearful. And nobody's talking about the mental health of the people and what do you give them to calm them down. What do? They go wherever they can find the alternatives. People still found alcohol. People still found tobacco because they got relief from it. And they now get it from sources that you cannot vet. You are making the people not safe. And in a sense, in retrospect, we should be glad that our government reacted the way they reacted around COVID. Because there's now evidence that that was based on a moral position and not driven by science. You have papers that have come through that show some protective effect of nicotine. They've not been widely promoted, Francois, but they are there in the literature. And when you look at it, if you smoke, you actually reduce costs to society because you're going to die early. If everything is true. The issues about in public, how you protect others, the space of others, your rights, we need to have a discussion about it. I am an advocate for harm reduction. There are lots of products that are alternatives. In medicine, we've had nicotine replacement therapy for how long, Francois? From the 80s. But when that nicotine comes from elsewhere, suddenly it's not good. But when it's sold by pharma and it's promoted by doctors, it's good. But when you can get it for yourself in the convenience store, it ceases to be good. Now suddenly nicotine shrinks the brain and all sorts of nonsense when we have been prescribing it. And because it comes from elsewhere, and there's an issue that everybody has that we never want to talk about. It's all about money. Because when you ban something, you create a different industry. Give people information so that they can make informed decisions. So tobacco harm reduction, there are alternatives to combustible cigarettes. And I challenge the companies out there, why are you still selling combustible cigarettes. Well, there are alternatives that you can make money with and people will be healthier for it. Harm reduction comes from when we fought about HIV and AIDS. You can't make this world a pure world. Let's stop dealing with things from a moral perspective. Let's be ethical. And the greatest ethical duty of a physician is to make sure that you give your patient the information so that they can make informed decisions, not dictate to them how they should lead their lives. And harm reduction in tobacco is a prime example of that. People pontificate when they know nothing. And I speak to colleagues, he doesn't even know what a cigarette is. But he'll tell the patient it's more dangerous. He's not read about it. He does not know what it looks like. He does not know what it entails, but he says it's dangerous. Heat not bad. He knows nothing about it. Snooze, he's never heard about it. But even the WHO had to publish the results of the health profile of the Swedes compared to the other European nations. Tobacco harm reduction is a concept that all of us should do. And lastly, I've learned that as a doctor, whatever we do, we harm reduction advocate. We can't cure HIV and AIDS. We can't cure diabetes, but we give advice and we reduce harm. That's what we do. And harm reduction in tobacco is the ethical thing to do, not moral. I believe in ethics, in not morality, because ethics are universal. Morality is about who taught you what and the prejudices that you've been given in life. Thank you.
Yo, awesome stuff, eh? Harm reduction advocates, ethics versus morality. We're really getting onto a good momentum here. And so let us listen to a little bit about the ethics. And it's my pleasure to invite Julian to join us now and for you to give us your insights into this discussion. Over to you, Julian.
I want to start by thinking about the rights of an individual versus the rights of the society in which they live. We've got to be clear that our society has moved to the concept, first of all, of privacy, that each individual is living in a castle and that castle shouldn't be manipulated, it shouldn't be got into by anybody else. Society has decided that the individual has great importance. Is that true? We should do anything we like as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. Trouble is, it does. Almost everything we do has an impact on other people in society. So let's think about that as we think about harm reduction in relation to drugs. Our society has made some very curious decisions. We allow alcohol. We even allow alcohol in excess most of the time. We allow tobacco. In fact, governments earn a fortune from taxing both alcohol and tobacco. We say no to most of the opiates, codeine, heroin, morphine. Mostly we say no. We say no to amphetamines. We sort of say no to cannabis, although cannabis use is suddenly increasing again. In fact, it was the then colony of Natal, which was one of the first places in the world to ban the use of cannabis in the middle of the 19th century. Why? What is the logic of allowing people to drink alcohol and not allowing them, and criminalizing them, in fact, for using cannabis or heroin or morphine outside the medical area? What is the logic of that? Can we actually defend some of these laws? If we take alcohol, South Africa has said, and I think rightly, that the number of people in hospital would be decreased massively if we didn't allow the sale of alcohol at certain times, So now in Nelson Mandela Bay, you're only allowed to buy alcohol between Monday and Thursday, and fairly restricted hours. And the weekend, alcohol is banned. Why? Because people imbibe too much and then interact with others in a way that causes problems. It doesn't really happen with cannabis. It doesn't really happen with even heroin. So let's think, why do we allow alcohol and not the others? We have a dilemma, and it's a real dilemma. Which drugs should we allow, if any? Which drugs should we ban, if any? And as was said earlier, what are the grounds for differentiating? How can we ensure that the science is followed? My personal conviction is that society both professes intolerance for the use of drugs and then provides the social setting to enable and make legitimate their use, even to the extent of making legitimate those who sell and distribute illegal drugs. It is abundantly clear that the war on drugs initiated by President Nixon nearly half a century ago, I guess, has failed. If anything, more drugs are now being used than ever before. The impact of illegal use of drugs on health is profound. Criminality has risen because people are forced to really take criminal actions in order to feed their habits. Policies on drugs cannot simply allow a free-for-all, however. We already restrict, as we said, tobacco and alcohol, specifically in South Africa during this COVID pandemic. There is a need for a new rational approach, addressing the needs of many to opt out for a short time from the realities around them, on condition that harm to others is not done, and assuring that addiction is properly addressed within a health service rather than through the criminal law. We need to think about those who deal in drugs now, who make double their money from the poor unfortunates upon whom they prey, because we've ensured that they can through the criminal justice system. Scientists and ethicists must step in and inform those who make policy of the harm being done to our society simply by the banning of things which some people feel they need. The scientific basis for most of the bans is not there. I agree fully with our colleague who said, why are we allowing cigarettes and essentially banning e-cigarettes? What's the logic? What's the scientific basis of that? So I sit here as an ethicist, having led the ethics committees of the European Union for a long time, and think, we've got it wrong, and we've got to go back and think how we can improve the system. Thank you very much.
We have one more presentation to take for now, and that's from David Boots Pedersen. And he's going to talk to us about evidence-based policy making versus policy-biased evidence making, why the Cape Town Declaration 2021 matters. Over to you, David.
I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective, trying to wrap things up a bit and speak from a more social scientific perspective on the need to communicate and engage policymakers, especially on these very complex issues that we're talking about today, and what is needed in that area. I think exactly to address issues that are very cross-cutting, such as the policy and practice of drug, alcohol, and tobacco control, we need to start working together more as a science collective across countries, across disciplines, across silos. And we need to give up on the ideal almost of the egocentric scientists competing against one another. There will be a very important opportunity to turn the recommendations and observations of this panel today into practice. We are coming together next year at the World Science Forum in Cape Town, a year from now in December 2021. Here I understand that a new Cape Town Declaration on Science, Society and Ethics will be announced, produced by the African Science Policy Community and bridging to similar global initiatives relevant for all countries. Preceding the Cape Town Declaration, I myself was one of the architects behind the Brussels Declaration on Science and Society. Here we published a small booklet, a 20-point blueprint that sets out new guidelines for ethics and principles to inform work at the borderline between science and society and policymaking. The Cape Town Declaration process is taking a similar bottom-up approach involving the grassroots, politicians, science advisors, chief scientific officers, also from industry, from civil society, medical doctors, social scientists, academics, and journalists. I think it's important to recognize, and this was exactly the baseline also of the Brussels Declaration, that science is only one part of a very complicated policy process, and that scientists ourselves cannot decide on what is good for society, but we can inform policymaking and guide politicians if they want to learn. Evidence is only one among many types of advice that inform the decision-making process. Above all, the meaning of risk and harm tends to vary. Risk or harm to a politician can be very different from that of a citizen or a scientist. Here we see from social science, psychology, communication science, my own disciplines as a professor in Copenhagen, that key determinants such as information selection, confirmation bias, pluralistic ignorance, tribalism, polarization will, as we move forward, require greater understanding and attention. And the same also goes with attention to ethical values, to our culture, to politics, and the impact any decision can have on other areas of policymaking. How to balance risk and precaution is a recurrent theme for policymakers and scientists across almost all national science advisory systems, or at least the ones I'm familiar with in Europe and globally. That said, the scientific community must also itself stand behind its evidence and shout up when policymakers clearly get it wrong and when lives matter. And while I have used here the examples of harm reduction, the interaction between science, values, concepts of risk and precaution pervade almost every aspect of society, whether it is dealing with drugs, alcohol, tobacco, climate change, or artificial intelligence. In every of these cases, both the natural and social sciences need to come together and work together in order to provide advice. And we need to continue to rethink and reshape the relationship between science and society to continuously ensure transparency and independence. I think this is the precarious role of science advisors and knowledge brokers ourselves who are present at this panel this afternoon, to inform policymakers the reality of policymaking and how that reality is often driven by values and beliefs, and then at the same time preserve the special voice and integrity of science and society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. So we've come through the full circle of presentations, and the striking feature thus far is the kind of understanding, one, that's evidence or scientific evidence is important in the use of decision making. David just told us that there are other aspects of the decision-making process that, in addition to evidence and science, is also necessary. So why do we find ourselves in this predicament that our policymakers came up with decisions that were devoid of a deeper understanding of the science evidence. How is it that this rigor of scientific knowledge and investigation from previous thinking did not play through during this period of the COVID pandemic? Dr. Letlapa, perhaps I'm going to start with you, because you have been at the forefront of leading with the Health Professionals Council. And, you kind of understand the workings of the professionals in this space. Where do you think we're getting it wrong? One,
I think in the South African context,
yeah,
the great issue is about addiction to control. And that's our biggest problem, is people want to control. You're a government, you want to control.
Right.
We doctors, we train to control the patient's lives. We're not facilitators. We give them instructions. Take this 3 times a day, come back next week. There's no engagement. There's no, this is your life. Here's the information that I have. So it's about control. So even when you look at the engagements about the MAC, it's about who's in control. So at the end, despite what you're bringing to the table, it's about, if I'm in charge and I'm being lobbied, if the others come that are speaking against what the science says, if I accede to the scientists, I'm not showing that I'm in control. So to the scientists, I can't listen to everything from them, because otherwise, why am I in power? Because it's now the scientists that are determining what should happen. So I feel I'm losing power. So somewhere I've got to modulate. Then the complicating factor in South Africa is religiosity. Everything is based about religion. And religion is about control. It becomes about part of being in control, and religiosity is about making people miserable, taking the joy away from them. You can't do sex to enjoy. You must only do it for procreation. You can't be inebriated because you look happy. And it's all about the control psyche and how we've been socialized in terms of religiosity. Things become about morality, cigarette and alcohol, those are sins. We collect a sin tax from them. And once everything has been labeled as sin, it's very easy to control people. Homosexuality is sinning. You then have an outpouring of hatred against those people, because those in control have declared it as sin, and it turns normal people into animals. So there's this issue about control, where we're not facilitators for people's lives, where when we get into power, we are not in service. We are in power. We are not public servants. We're not serving the public. We're telling the public how to live. Look at COVID. The science is simple. Why do we have to wait for instructions from government to do the right thing for our neighbor, for our grandma, for our family? When we know that it's an infectious disease, highly infectious, it spreads through close contact. We know that. Why are we waiting for a command structure to tell us what to do? Have we lost our minds and our sensibilities as human beings? When here's the science, apply it, protect others, protect yourself. We want a police state. We want somebody to go around with a gun to say, you're not wearing a mask, I'm going to arrest you. So it's the issue about control and believing in miracles, the way we've been socialized and indoctrinated.
Well said. Francois, how do we overcome this addiction of control? How do we as individuals, firstly, stand up to it, and how do we empower ourselves, our family, and our extended family and society to take this on?
I think it's complex, and I think some of the stuff Kosi was alluding to, and I think the 3 examples are good ones. The opiates issue, the alcohol and the tobacco one. In some ways, at this stage of when I see tobacco, every single warning that could possibly be issued to somebody who's using combustible tobacco has been issued. There's obviously new generations of people entering, more education, and I think that we're seeing that. With alcohol, I think what Julian was talking about, it's more complicated. With tobacco, once we banned it from restaurants, our home is still an issue. And essentially, secondhand smoke is really being taken away. That individual is taking harm, is putting themselves in harm's way, fully knowledgeable about what they're doing at this stage. And to my mind, I have no problem with that. If somebody that makes you feel good, go ahead. Alcohol is more complicated because we have the issue of gender-based violence. We have the issue of drinking and driving. People stab each other outside the bar. So there is a much more complicated debate around alcohol that I think needs to be had. But I do think that when we say, oh, we need to ban cannabis, we need to ban opiates and things, we need to know what the consequences of that are for the people who are using that and the harms that are being actually perpetuated. One of the biggest things I saw was dealing with heroin addicts in Hillbrow. And somebody turned to me and said, it's not actually the heroin. It's the lifestyle that they're getting forced into. They were found unconscious, kicked in the head, stabbed. They were beaten up by the cops when they were found, stealing car radios in those days and things. So it was really the life around it that was actually causing them the health harm. And when they said that, something went off in my head, which was like, actually, we're the problem. And then I heard of people saying, why just give them heroin? Give them weapons-grade, pure heroin that we use heroin medically, in many countries, well, in South Africa, for control of cardiac pain and myocardial infarctions. We've got perfect dosed heroin that could be manufactured to pharmaceutical standards that is dirt cheap, that could be given out. And many countries have experimented with these models. Honestly, give them clean needles. One of the other things that happened when I worked in NHS was I had somebody who was an addict who was running an entire company with 60 individuals. He was completely functional. Like it was not the stereotype of a toothless heroin addict in the streets of Hillbrow that I'd been sold. It was a fully functional human being. And that's why I think these kind of stereotyping, and there are so many myths. We've just finished the guidelines series looking at myths around illicit drug use. But there are so many myths that I was taught as a medical student that are just wrong. They were wrong from the outset. And that's why I say the medical community and the scientific community, probably the first step is to correct those myths and to say this to the politicians, everyone else. When you say something like one shot of heroin, you're addicted for life, like that is factually untrue. When we say that we are paying we are taxing cigarette owners because so they can subsidize their emphysema oxygen treatment future, that is not true. And we must stop colluding with those discussions so that we can have a rational adult discussion about what individuals things. And then with alcohol, when you say it's like which behaviors are impacting on other people that are harmful. And that is a much more complex and difficult discussion to my mind than the issues around opiates and tobacco.
Yeah, no, thank you. Sean, so far we've been tackling the tobacco, the alcohol, and to some extent the drug connectivity. How do we change these perceptions?
My personal experience has showed me the best way to change it is to introduce people, to humanize the dehumanized. We must remember that in the United Nations documents, there's only one reference to the term evil, and that's in the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. Drug addiction and drug use, and therefore the people who use drugs are declared a great social evil. And we've got a problem with that because really that's just dehumanizing a particular group of people. And I think we've heard some really good examples here on the myths around the science that are building up to support this moral position. And so I've found that when you humanize people, you start getting changes. And when a whole bunch of kids are playing in the playground at school, and you ask them to come into maths, not many of them are going to come into maths, but a lot of them will come in for story time, even if the stories are made up. And that's what's happened with the rest of the world. We haven't grown up. We haven't become mature in these kinds of things. We want to blame somebody. And it's the same with the over-pathologization of drug use as well, is that we're now seeing in the United States, we had the prison industrial complex, and then somebody worked out you can charge patients more than you can charge prisoners. And so now we've got this addiction industrial complex, where Nora Volker describes addiction as a lifelong relapsing disease of the brain, which left untreated will result in death. That's rubbish. The vast majority of people self-resolve their drug use problems. 70% that do resolve it without any form of intervention whatsoever from the medical fraternity. So we're talking about a small group of people who do need medical help. We're talking about the majority of people needing medical help because of the lack of intervention. So Injecting drug use does not spread HIV. What spreads HIV is a non-sterile needles. People are unable to get them, because otherwise we have a problem with insulin-dependent people. This is why we need to ask why. So to change the narrative, I believe we need to work at community levels, and we need to change people's minds to see people as people. We all use drugs in some kind of a way. If you cut out addiction, you cut out the ability to enter into a relationship. And probably our biggest addiction in South Africa is to these really bad ideas. And to extend what we've been talking about here, we talk about imperialism and colonialism in South Africa. And yet we've fallen foul of our people by relying on the two most imperial and colonialist mechanisms of control we have, and that is the war on drugs and the church. And we've got to get over it.
As a society, more than 95% of us are steeped into some form of religious indoctrination. And this is where the issue of morality comes in. I mean, you could be talking to a class of human geneticists, which I have done in my career. And when they're sitting in the class, they will respond to you as scholars in human genetics. We teach them ethics outside of that classroom, and you just go home. And suddenly in a different world, everything that we've learned becomes unlearned because of our acculturation into our societal norms. So as individuals, the complexity of these, where we have to wear these multiple caps, becomes very difficult for influential minds to take on. But unfortunately, not all of us can jump to that situation to fight the kind of societal norm. This is the problem that I think we are facing in the wider society. I'd like for you both, David and Julian, to shed some light from the thinking where you've been niched on these points.
I think that you formulated it very precisely. I do not think that it is a particular African problem. It's a problem of human nature, that we do have very strong biases in the way we are recruiting information, and that we are organizing our belief systems, influenced, as you said, indoctrinated by culture, by religion, by capitalism, by society, by what we call in-group behavior. And oftentimes, and this again goes back to almost hardwired into our nature, we are gonna focus on the beliefs, and we are gonna receive new information in a way that is most in accordance with our pre-existing beliefs. It's much more economic for us to organize our belief systems in ways which is, in a way, bound up to a narrative, bound up to our culture, to our identity, cognitive identity. It makes the world have a sense. So this is a huge problem for science, especially at the intersection with policymaking, because there you need to be able to address scientific issues without immediately seeing conflict, controversy, contested values, or emotions. So how do you do that? That's in a way that is the key, I would say, research question for science communication today. And what we know from the literature and what we have seen expanding over the last couple of years is that, first of all, we need humility. What does not work is to be too firm or being too aggressive in the way we are communicating evidence. We have to be self-assured that the evidence is there, but then we have to find venues to connect that evidence with ways of communicating that does not harm people, or that does not, as it were, contribute to more polarization. So constantly thinking about that there is no them and us, that there is no elite and population, but that evidence and facts and science and learning benefits all parts of society. So there, I think scientists, I mean, yeah, perhaps not, but in the ideal world, you would also be able to deliver an effective criticism of society, need some facts or some evidence. So what I think is needed there is to reconnect science communication or science advice for policymakers to values, to narratives, to humility, transparency, and open up the conversation rather than closing it down.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Julian.
At the moment, I'm busy writing on behalf of the European Union a document on gene editing, in particular editing the genes of humans. And the question we've been asked is, should we? Should we do that in a way which is not harmful to the individual who we're modifying or to their descendants if it's heritable? And that becomes quite an interesting question, because different religious backgrounds cause real differences in understanding. And in Europe, this has become very interesting. But hang on, there's 3 generations down the line haven't given their permission. How do we handle that one? So those who come from Southern Europe say you can't do it at all. Those who come from the middle of Europe say only for those in somatic cells. And those from sort of Britain and I guess Denmark, David will correct me, no problem, virtually. We're starting to see this breakdown of an ethical position modified by, as was said earlier, by the moral position which comes from the background that we come from. And this is true for drugs as well. For some reason, people believe, it's the right word, that use of mind-altering substances is wrong. There isn't a reason for that. They just say it's wrong. You should never let go in that way. You should never allow yourself to be altered. If that's the case, I can see the logic of what they're saying. But then we have to ask, what about the individual? If I want to modify myself, can I? And those are the sorts of issues which I think we've got to address very carefully as humans. We've got another problem which David alludes to, and I think it's important, and that is education. And a lot of people say, we'll solve this problem by telling people what to do. But we're the experts, and if we tell them, they'll get it right. And that doesn't work.
Any other comments?
And part of maybe being a better society is that if I have certain aspects of my life, how do they impact on other aspects? And there has to be a continuity. You know, I can't go to church and be a Christian for 2 hours on a Sunday and be a devil to co-workers on a Monday to Friday. Should it not inform who I am, how I live my life, so that it's part of what I do because it's making me a better person? Is it, we've got a tick box life, like you've said, and we need to go beyond the issue of a tick box life, because that would create a society where we accept others for who they are.
Absolutely.
Not for what we want them to be.
And I couldn't have said it better, because that is definitely a challenge that we as a society have to respond to. We cannot be schizophrenic in the way in which we live our lives, wearing different caps for different
And one last thing,
contexts.
because I spoke about tobacco harm reduction.
Yes.
What I want to leave people with is that we should remember that smokers are human beings too.
Yes.
And they have rights.
Yes.
In conclusion, from my side, I'd just like to say, also just to say that I started an organization called the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs, specifically to bring the voice of people who use drugs into the debate. I'm also a researcher at the University of Pretoria, and I think David will strongly agree we need to have much more intersectionality. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Essentially, we say people make economic decisions. They do. They make economic decisions about drugs as well. It is healthy for your brain to develop a default mode network so that we can simplify decision making. We've got to ask why people find more meaning in heroin than in relationships around them.
ultimately, we are relational beings. We are going to form a relationship either with somebody, with a deity, or with a drug. And there's been no society since the beginning of mankind that hasn't altered their state of mind. It's pointless trying to fight it. In fighting it, we're going to cause more harm. We just need to look at the person next to us and accept them for who they are and get over the fact that some people do better on drugs.
Thank you very much. Francois?
I think just coming to Sean, and of course you also alluded to it, humanization of this. What's challenged me is actually meeting people who use drugs, and they are human beings, and they're sometimes highly successful human beings. So there's stereotypes, but I've been challenged with stereotypes since I grew up in apartheid South Africa. Meeting black people, meeting Indian people, meeting colored people is a big deal, challenging my stereotypes. Then I had to meet gay people that challenged my stereotypes. Now I'm meeting transgender people and having to deal with those stereotypes, and it was all part of this challenge. That is when you start having to speak to somebody face to face and tell them you're not a human being. It's just that's not possible. And I think just because my role is often to beat up politicians, but when we see drug use in this country, when we look at the Cape Flats and we talk about a tick epidemic, that community has been decimated by poverty, by poor housing, by lack of opportunity, by poor education, by violence. It was a political failure, and now everyone gets to point at tick. And I've realized that for so much of this, whether it's waking up in the morning drinking coffee or me drinking red wine in the evening to calm the anxiety of a busy day, we all self-medicating each other in different ways, and how that works for each individual needs to happen. We need to make it as safe as possible as medical practitioners, and we need people to understand the risks. But I think that we also need to be, it was David who talked about humility. We need the humility to understand that a lot of what we've been putting out there is absolute nonsense. Of course, he talked about it and own that and say, how can we keep people as safe as possible, but also allow them to have as much individual choice as possible?
Thank you for that. David, some concluding remarks from your end?
Not really. I think we managed to get around the topic quite well here. Actually, I found it very inspiring and interesting. We are confronted with a lot of the similar topics in other areas of policy making, in harm reduction, in tobacco, drugs, alcohol, sexual diseases, and so on. This is a very specific problem because there are so much emotion, culture, religion, and also science and evidence involved that it's really a melting pot of different belief systems. So I really wanted to support and echo your remarks about the sectorial integration and getting across communities, both the scientific and the civil, but also in civil society, really bridging between different stakeholder groups and including all voices, and taking the time and, as I said, the humility to listen and also respond, because we need to find a way to broker evidence and science and education. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Julian, over to you for some concluding comments.
What we're seeing is this holding up the individual against the state, and I like that, and I like that very much. But the balance to assure that you don't harm anybody else must be part of the equation. Thanks.
What a truly inspirational discussion this has been. You have each shared perspectives from your own experiences and questioned many of the things we sometimes never even challenge ourselves into thinking. And at the bottom of all of this, from the understanding that irrespective of whether you're a drug or an alcohol or a tobacco user, and you may have deleterious effects from it, at the end of the day, we are all humans. And the bottom line is we need to inculcate this idea of respect for anyone, irrespective of, the circumstances under which he or she may see themselves. And once we instill this issue of respect, it somehow goes with human solidarity and showing a helping hand to fellow individuals who may not be in a situation that we are and needs a helping hand. I think it's timeless that our politicians and policymakers also had a course on trying to distinguish what is it that they do in the context of their individual belief systems versus what we should be doing in the context of what is for the better good of all of humankind and society. And we can only hope that we get to that sort of point of thinking soon in a collegial kind of way, because if we always err on the part of making rash and radical decisions without looking at the bigger picture, we will never move to an environment where we could have better choices for all. So thank you, colleagues. I, for one, really learned a lot from you all, and it's been a sheer honor for me to have had this opportunity to be in your midst. And I want to thank SciCom, and in particular Aidan Gilligan, for bringing this session together, and to my colleague Nadia, who has been in the corner helping out with the technology, and to the support staff at Science Forum. Thank you all, and I wish you a good day further. All the best. Bye for now.